Okay, we're on to our last part of the videos for 1450 to 1650, the age of global interactions, the age of exploration. And what we're going to do now is move to Africa and then finish up with Eurasia, particularly Asia and Russia, and take a look at how people were responding to the new social, economic, and political situations that were developing throughout the world. So, what I'd like to begin with is Portuguese colonialism, and you can see that they're indicated right down here. And the Portuguese, keep in mind, once again, were the first to settle on the coast of Africa, and particularly they're settling along these four coasts. So, if you remember, it's the Gold Coast, the Ivory Coast, the Grain Coast, and the Slave Coast. So, those are the commodities that they're seeking and searching for in Africa. They're limited to the coast and they never really penetrate the interior, at least not until after the Industrial Revolution, in part because of the diseases that are in the interior of Africa, to which the Europeans have no immunity. So it is not until later, when we have medicines developing during the chemical phase of the second part of the Industrial Revolution, that Europeans for the first time are able to really go into the interior of Africa and dominate those large empires that had existed there for centuries. In addition to the disease, though, there were other things that were keeping Europeans along the coast and not allowing them to penetrate into the interior. So the next thing besides disease is really knowledge of the terrain, knowledge of the interior. Finally, technology. Keep in mind, Europeans were not powerful at this point. They were starting to explore, but they are up against some of the most powerful empires that have ever existed. In Africa, you're talking about Mali and Mali and Songhai, particularly the Songhai Empire. You're talking about empires in Congo. You're talking about these very advanced empires that they have no chance at this stage of really conquering. So for all of these regions, the power of the empires that exist there in Africa, the lack of knowledge that Europeans have of the interior, no steamboats yet to go into the interior via the rivers, and also the immunity or lack thereof to diseases in Central Africa. All of these things are going to keep the Portuguese on the coast. And you'll remember some of the explorers that you want to keep in mind. Da Gama is going to be, Diaz is the first to go around the tip of Africa, but Da Gama is the first that's going to actually go into the Indian Ocean and establish trade for the Portuguese there. So unlike the Spaniards, who focused predominantly on the New World, the Portuguese are much more concerned with the Old World, with Africa and the Indian Ocean. Brazil is significant for them, but more as something kind of not tangential, but their main focus is going to be early on Africa and the Indian Ocean. Now, when they fail in the Indian Ocean and start to lose power in those regions, then they're going to start to focus more on Brazil. And we see later on during the Napoleonic phase of the French Revolution, of course, that's where the king and his family flees to, is Brazil, not Africa, not places along the Indian Ocean. And the reason being, in Brazil, they actually had a colony, a proper colony, whereas in the Old World, because of the powerful empires that existed, Europeans are being kept to the coast, just to these, single trade cities. So they're not able to establish colonies in the Old World yet. That will come later. Now, the fortified settlements that they have along the coast of Africa, a great example of one is Elmina. Elmina was located kind of like right about in here. And all of these settlements along the coast were heavily fortified, so that they were forts as well as trade centers. Now, the fact that they were fortified had more to do with the Europeans fighting against other Europeans than the Europeans fighting against the host empires in Africa, or, for example, in the Indian Ocean region. So they're fortified, but more so for the other Europeans and the competition that's arising among European powers. The last thing to remember about the Portuguese is that as they build up the slave trade, and the Portuguese are the first to become involved in the slave trade in Africa outside of Africans and Arabs. As the slave trade intensifies, leaders within Africa are going to start to see that this is becoming a problem and petition to have things changed. Of course, that's not going to happen. But a great example is the letter that King Membe writes to the King of Portugal asking that the slave trade be diminished. His argument is that it is harming the population too much. It's taking too many people. Now, remember, we looked at the documents, however, that indicated that what had really started to change for King Membe was that the demand for slaves was becoming so high that it wasn't just regular common people that were being attacked and taken, but now you saw the upper portions of society, of African society, being targeted as well. And really, it's that switch to now important people, rich people, potentially becoming enslaved that's going to lead King Membe to write that letter and to petition for change. So once again, I want to complicate that letter by King Membe a little bit. Often people are going to use that to say that, oh, well, look, the African leaders are petitioning the Europeans to stop. But it's much more complicated than that. The king was absolutely encouraging the slave trade when it was lower class people. It's only when some of their own people start to be targeted more and more that they start to see it and view it as a bad thing and change their views. Because in Africa, in societies, traditionally, land ownership was not as extensive as it was private property. And you actually determined wealth based on how many slaves you had, how many cattle you owned, things like that. So slave trade was a source of wealth in Africa, and that was true for King Membe and everybody else. So it's only when that switch happens and upper class people begin to be targeted that he's going to write that letter. Now let's take a look at some ways that the slave trade is going to change and some things that are going to happen to kind of keep the population fairly stable, regardless of the fact that so many millions of people are being taken from Africa and shipped to the Americas. So after the Portuguese start the slave trade, the Spaniards take it over. And then when the Spaniards lose, I think it's the 100 Years' War. When the Spaniards lose one of the wars, they actually sell the control over the African slave trade to the British. So here now we're up in this section, and we're going to be looking at the slave trade, Spanish-British colonialism. So remember, the thing that's going to change the slave trade is when the British take over. They have already established major triangular trade route throughout the Atlantic. Initially, go back and look at your chart. Initially, remember, it's starting up in Britain, going over to the Caribbean, and then from the Caribbean up to the Americas, and the Americas back to Britain. Once they gain Asiento, which is the sale of the slave trade from Spain to Britain, then that triangular trade system shifts so that you have them starting up in England, and down here it indicates what is going where, so that weapons and cloth are being sold from England down into Africa. They're trading those goods for slaves. The slaves are then going out. Remember what that's called. That's called the Middle Passage. We had a number of readings on those. We looked at images as well. And then those slaves are being shipped over to Caribbean. And then the raw materials like molasses and sugarcane and so forth are being shipped back to England. So you have a shift in the triangular trade once the Brits gain control of the slave trade, which is Asiento. At that same time, the slave trade is going to increase substantially because the British are kind of starting to not industrialize, but they're definitely focusing on production as opposed to mining and things like that. So the plantation systems that they're developing are highly advanced, and they're going to be needing and supplying slaves not only for their own plantations, but also for the Spaniards. So they're good, and the Portuguese in Brazil. So they're servicing all of the Americas with their slave trade. And they're going to increase that because they're going to kind of not industrialize it, but almost industrialize it. They're going to make it very systematic and it's going to become much more intensive. Now, what is happening with the population in Africa is quite interesting, because even though millions of people are being taken from Africa, the population is remaining fairly stable. And we see down here some of the reasons that the population is staying stable. One, the main one, is the Columbian Exchange, that these new crops are coming over to Africa. And even though people are being taken and shipped to the Americas, millions of people, you see population and birth rates just generally increasing because of these new crops that are coming over, and more food equals more people, that pattern that we see and saw during the Song Dynasty and see everywhere else. So the population increase due to the Columbian Exchange, in part, is canceling out the loss of people that would have happened or was happening because of the slave trade. The second factor keeping the population stable is that the majority of slaves being taken were male, so that women, who were the ones actually having the babies reproduce, they were able to stay in Africa and reproduce, so that the population declined, but not at the rate that you might think had it been mostly women, or even an equal number of men and women being taken. And then finally, an interesting kind of method of supply and demand was operating naturally in Africa. What people would do is they would take many slaves from one section of Africa, but then as the slaves in that region started to diminish and the supply increased in other sections that weren't being tapped into, well, then they would switch and start taking slaves from that region where the supply was really high. Once that region started to be depleted, other regions started to have a surplus in the supply of slaves, so then the trade would shift there and so forth, so that it was constantly moving during this time, so that different parts of Africa were being tapped for slaves at different points in time. Now, what that meant for the population is that no one area was being depleted so much that they couldn't reproduce. So it was almost like the shifting supply and demand allowed the populations to kind of rejuvenate themselves, so that you didn't have a huge decline in any area. And so all of these things, mostly men being taken, the shifting demand, and new crops from the Columbian Exchange, really allow Africa's population to decrease not nearly as much as it would have. And if you look at the numbers, almost remain stable, regardless of the fact that millions of people were being taken and shipped to the Americas. Now, the final thing that you had studied in this section is this interesting dynamic between the English and the Dutch in Africa. So the Dutch had settled the southern tip of Africa, and the Dutch people there are going to become known as Afrikaners. Afrikaners are simply Dutch people who live in South Africa. They're also going to be known as another name, the Boers. And in the 7 Years' War, the Dutch are going to lose this part of South Africa because the French had gained some control over parts of this. And when the French lose the 7 Years' War, the English are going to be awarded control of like the very tip, so that the Dutch are there, but now the English are there too. So you have the Dutch and the English both in South Africa. Now, of course, this is not going to be a good thing. The English will start to push the Dutch out, and we're going to see that in the next unit that we study, how that happens and how the English come to control all of South Africa. But for right now, I want you to remember that the English are gaining access to South Africa during the 7 Years' War, and that the Dutch are known as Afrikaners and are starting to be displaced a little bit from South Africa. That's really what we need to know about Africa for this stage. You'll want to go back and you'll want to reread a lot of the material that I gave you on the Middle Passage, that length of triangular trade under British rule that took the slaves from Africa to the Americas. A lot of details there. I want you to go back and look at those to refresh your memory. Okay, final bit. Now what we're going to do is look at the Portuguese and the Indian Ocean. We're going to start there. We're going to look at English and Dutch colonization throughout the Indian Ocean region. And then we're going to look at some of the responses from the older empires, land-based empires, that were not moving to sea-based empires, like the Ottomans, the Safavids, the Mughals, Ming Dynasty China, Qing Manchu China, Tokugawa or Edo period, and then Tsarist Russia. So let's start with the Portuguese. So we'll know from the previous one, if you refresh your memory of what we just mentioned in Africa, the Portuguese are the first to go around the tip of Africa. And when Da Gama enters into the Indian Ocean trade network, he's going to change it in a series of ways. So probably the most significant is that he brings violence into this, what used to be a very cooperative, peaceful relay system between all of these different trade diasporas. Now you have the Portuguese coming in, and they have cannons on their boats. They've taken the gunpowder from China and industrialized it, mechanized it. They're producing weapons with it. This is your first arms race, is going to be one that develops in Europe around this point in time, producing cannons and then later firearms. So they're going to be the first to bring violence into this system, and for a brief time come to dominate. When they dominate with the use of violence, they also try to set up a system of passes. What these are taxes that they plan to charge everybody as they go into ports throughout the Indian Ocean. The problem with this is that Portugal is so small and the Indian Ocean is so big that there's no way that they can control that. So they take on too much in the Indian Ocean. And we see then really 5 key things that are going to lead to their downfall in the Indian Ocean. First, because it's so large of a region and they're so far away from the mother country, from this mechanism of control, you're going to see a lot of corruption being widespread throughout Portuguese who are operating in the Indian Ocean. Also, the military is highly undisciplined. So they had a military, but they didn't have the rigor and the discipline behind the military that they would have needed to actually pull something this large off. In addition to that, once again, going along with the corruption, they're so far away from Portugal, from the mother country, that merchants and individuals for the Portuguese, representing the Portuguese, they start to work as private merchants, not giving everything back to the king of Portugal, keeping a lot of what they make for themselves, and really operating just like any other trade diaspora would, except by using violence and less cooperation. On top of that, they are simply too small. They don't have the numbers in order to, once again, like pull something like this off. And then in conjunction with that, but slightly different, you have other nations then starting to see what Portugal and Spain are doing, so that these other competitors are starting to rise up. First the Dutch, then the French, and then the English. And eventually the Portuguese, for all of the 4 reasons listed above, they simply can't compete. So that really spells the end of the Portuguese in the Indian Ocean regarding dominance. And you see instead 2 different nations, the English and the Dutch, starting to have colonies in this part of the world. Now, the interesting thing about the English in the Indian Ocean and the Dutch in the Indian Ocean is that for both of those, the English and the Dutch, once again, they have just minor settlements, they're trade settlements, fortified, and they're on the coast. They're not being allowed by the huge empires that are there. They're not being allowed to penetrate the interior. They're not taking over. So in India, for example, the English is very limited. The English are very limited by the Indian government. Make no mistake, the Indian government is completely in control. They're just allowing the English to be there in one of those port cities to trade. Same is true with the Dutch over here in Indonesia. Once again, it's the governments in Oceania who are in charge. They're simply allowing the Dutch to be there. And the same was true up here in China. Remember some of the violence that the Chinese do against the Europeans who are there trading and dare to go against their rules. They behead them. They parade the heads throughout the streets as a warning to other people to not disobey. So even though Europeans are in this part of the world, at this point in time, they are not powerful. They are not strong. They are being allowed to be there as trade merchants, and that is it. So it is still those old land-based empires who have control over the situation in this part of the world. And I don't want you to forget that. It's not until after the Industrial Revolution that you see Europeans really being able to manipulate and change the system to their advantage. Okay, so that's the European presence in the Indian Ocean. Let's talk now about how these old world empires are starting to respond to the changes that are taking place during this period. So you have two different forms of empire building that are being practiced here. You have the old land-based systems, the land-based empires. You see them throughout Asia and Africa. And then you also see these new sea-based empires, which is what Europe is employing. The benefits of the sea-based empires, as you see when we get to the Industrial Revolution, is that it allows them to have a diversity of raw materials, as well as cheap labor and huge markets for their finished goods. So we see major advantages developing from these larger colonial empires that are not contiguous, that are not that don't have a center and expand out contiguously from this center. So we see a new thing happening with these sea-based empires that Europe is going to create. Now, with all of the old land-based empires, Ottomans, Safavids, Mughals, Qing Manchu, Ming, and Tokugawa Japan somewhat, Russia somewhat, we're going to see more or less successful responses to the changing global economic patterns that are developing during this time period. So I want to begin over here with the Ottomans and kind of take a look simultaneously at both the Ottomans and the Safavids. Safavids we're not going to do much with, frankly. The thing I want you to remember about the Safavids is that they are coming out of Persia and that they are in constant conflict with the Ottomans. Europeans are going to use this to their advantage. Some Europeans are going to support the Ottomans in their fight against the Safavids. Others might support the Safavids in their fight against the Ottomans. But as long as the Europeans keep the Safavids and Ottomans fighting one another, it's playing right into their hands because it's weakening both groups, and eventually the Europeans are going to be able to come in and gain more and more control over time. So I want to focus more so on the Ottomans in particular and kind of just leave those general statements as enough for the Safavids. So the Ottomans, what do you need to know? Of course, first you need to know 1453 and the impact that the Ottomans are going to have on stimulating this entire new system of exploring through the Atlantic. Then you want to know that they are basically controlling these land-based trade routes. So the old way of building contiguous land-based empires is what they're focusing on. So they're focusing very much on land-based militaries, expanding contiguously out from this central location. Eventually, they are going to, because of their fighting with the Safavids, they're going to allow the Europeans to gain more and more influence. The Europeans are going to loan them money, loan them supplies, and that's just a first step in the Europeans kind of gaining some influence in their economics. During the latter part of the period, you see that intensifying more and more and more. And part of that is going to be due to the millet system. Remember, the Ottomans have a millet system that's going to break up their empire into these religiously based smaller units. That's the way land-based empires had always controlled very diverse groups within their empire. They did not have a mother country colony relationship the way Europe will develop with its overseas colonies. Instead, land-based empires are going to use more of the hegemonic tools, where they're going to allow some of the regions on the fringe of their empire, the extreme edge of their empire, to have some autonomy. This is going to facilitate those regions staying part of the empire and make it so that the central part of the empire doesn't have to constantly be controlling them and sending military out there and things like that. So the millet system was this way to give some religious autonomy to the diverse groups of people that the Ottoman Empire controlled. The Europeans, however, are going to take advantage of that and over time slowly make the argument that they should have more of a say in the government of those particular regions. Those regions are going to want to support that as a way to kind of break away from the Ottoman Empire and gain perhaps independence, particularly later when political revolutions start to take hold and sweep throughout Europe. So that the hegemony that's being used with the autonomy that's given to these religious sectors, the millet system, we're going to see the Europeans take advantage of that as well. And that's going to allow Europeans to influence the Ottoman Empire even more. Finally, the last thing you want to remember about the Ottomans is the use of child labor, turning them into janissaries. And the process via which they were able to do that was devshirme. You'll remember when the Ottomans take over what was the former Yugoslavia, so up in this part of the world, this was Christian Europe. And when they take over that part of the world, they're going to demand a tax of the Christians. And the tax is going to be that they must turn over one of their sons. The sons that they would take would be quite young, so that they could then, for all intents and purposes, brainwash them into becoming good, loyal servants of the Sultan. And then those janissaries, which that's what they became, would be sent out throughout the empire as emissaries for the empire. And those people, because they were taken so young, were very, very very reliable representatives of the Ottoman Empire. They were also made into eunuchs so that they could not have any children, families of their own, and that increased their allegiance to the Ottoman Empire as well. Well, maybe not. You might not have liked the Ottoman Empire for doing that, but it did ensure that you didn't have family ties that might overrun your ties to the Sultan, to the Ottoman Empire. So devshirme and the janissaries was a really important part of this as well. Okay, so leaving the Ottomans, we're going to go over to the Mughals. And the Mughals, let me go up a little bit further. The Mughals, what you want to remember about them is that there was a series of Islamic leaders. So the Mughal Empire is the main period when Islam comes into India and dominates. Now, remember why that is kind of not ironic, but why that is unusual. The majority of the population in India is Hindu. So what you have happening, and what makes it unusual, is that you have this Islamic minority ruling over a Hindu majority. And the first Islamic leader to come over was Babur, his son Akbar, and then grandson Aurangzeb are the three that you really need to know. Babur, of course, claiming to be a descendant from both Chinggis Khan and Timur the Lame, is going to have great power and prestige. He's going to be kicked out of the Indian Mughal region for a little while, but then be able to come back. And you see that, how do I want to say this? You see that he's the first one that kind of really consolidates Islamic leadership in India, and he's the founder. He's the founder of the Mughal Empire. Akbar is by far the most important. What you need to remember about him is that he was highly tolerant. So he is the one that is going to get rid of the tax on anyone who's non-Muslim. Babur had actually set that up so that all people who were not Muslim in the Mughal Empire were forced to pay a tax. Akbar is going to remove that. He's also going to reach out to princes and marry his daughters to some of those princes who are Hindu, trying to consolidate his power and create a more cohesive empire with everyone involved in politics. This launches the Mughal Empire into its golden age. Akbar to this day is known as Akbar the Great. All of that, however, is reversed by the end of the Mughal Empire, which really the death knells are struck when Aurangzeb becomes leader. If you remember, he's the one that becomes leader by killing his brothers, sending his one brother's head in a box to Shah Jahan, who he is imprisoned in the Taj Mahal. So just an awful, violent person. And Aurangzeb's also the one, though, more importantly, that is going to bring back all of the taxes and really create those divisions once again between the Mughals and the Hindus. Between the Muslims and the Hindus in India. So politically, you want to remember the tolerance as well as the syncretism that happens under Akbar. If you remember syncretism within the language, but also syncretism within the religion, talking about Urdu and Din Ilahi. Urdu being the language, Din-e-Ilahi being the religion. Akbar was very concerned with bringing all groups together, and unfortunately, that's all reversed later by Aurangzeb. The other things, though, that you need to remember about the Mughals is that we can potentially ask, why didn't India industrialize first? Why didn't India become capitalist before Britain, for example? Because India, just like China, was highly advanced. They had an amazing guild system that had developed. It was much more based on family than in Europe, and perhaps that's why Europe was a little bit more advanced than India in regards to that. The family dynamic of the guilds in India might have held them back a little bit. But India had a much better system of kind of like supply and demand regarding taxation and the freedom of merchants. If you remember, merchants in India were very, very mobile. And if a prince in one port city started to raise taxes on them, all they had to do was up and leave and go to a neighboring city that had lower taxes. And what this did, just like supply and demand, just like capitalism, is it forced all of the princes to keep those taxes fairly low because they didn't want to lose the merchants and all of the money that came from that merchant activity. So they had a highly advanced system there of economics, and they just didn't go quite as far as the Dutch or as the British, but they were definitely on that same path. The last thing to remember about the Mughals, just like the Ottomans, just like the Safavids, they're worried about forming land-based contiguous empires. They're not focusing on developing a huge navy. They're not focusing on exploration. They're not focusing on forming colonies in other parts of the world, particularly the Americas. And eventually that's going to be something that will decrease their power and hurt them quite a bit. Okay, let's move on to China. Now, the first stage of China during this period is going to be the Ming Dynasty. And if you remember, initially the Ming are actually expanding and they're developing an amazing navy. They have one of the strongest in the world. We see the voyages of Zheng He, who goes all throughout in the Indian Ocean, going to Africa, the Middle East, India, Oceania, just traveling all over and bringing back so many exotic riches for China. And then it all stops. And the question becomes, why? Well, during the Ming period, you do start to see more and more attacks from the semi-nomadic populations from the region of the world in which the Mongols had come. And with these greater internal threats, the Ming decide to isolate. They decide to shut down and focus on internal trade. So here we can see they're starting to rebuild the Grand Canal and intensify the Grand Canal. They're starting to rebuild the walls, the Great Wall of China that we have here, and then isolate regarding Europeans. So this is still the influence of neocolonialism as well, only now it's being taken to a whole nother level. They're going to create the Canton system, one city of Canton. They're going to force all the Europeans who want to trade to be in that city only. They are not permitted anywhere else in China. And then even while they're there, they're being monitored by the Kohong. And the Kohong are Chinese families who are given the right to kind of monitor and oversee these European merchants while they are there. So this is a highly regimented system that develops in order to isolate European influence and keep them just in these coastal regions. If you'll remember, initially Europeans are being allowed a little bit more freedom. Christian missionaries, the Jesuits, are coming over, and they're able to actually convert about 100,000 Chinese people to Christianity. And you still have a Christian presence in China today. But all of that is going to change once the Ming decide to isolate. And then that's going to intensify even more when you get to the Qing Manchu period. The Manchu people are semi-nomadic people that come in and end the mandate of heaven for the Ming, starting the Qing dynasty. But they are going to follow suit. As semi-nomadic people often do, they settle, they assimilate, and take on whatever the previous people had done. So they follow the path of the Ming and isolate even more. Maintaining the Canton system, keeping the isolation of Europeans, building the Grand Canal, and focusing on internal trade. So the response of China, both during the Ming and Qing dynasties, is to isolate and isolate dramatically. The response of the Mughals is to kind of just keep doing the same old thing they'd always done with these land-based empires, starting to develop commercial infrastructure, but not going far enough. And then the response of the Ottomans is very similar to that. Once again, kind of building up, and the Safavids as well, focusing on and building up those contiguous land-based empires, developing a little bit of commercial infrastructure, not nearly as much as India, but not taking it far enough and allowing Europeans too much access into their economics and then eventually politics. Okay, 2 more to do. Finally, let's look at Japan. The Tokugawa period or Edo period in Japan is a feudal period. So the earliest region of the world to actually have this feudal structure is going to be China, with the Xie, Shang, and Zhong dynasties, your first 3 dynasties in China. That's going to be your feudal period there. It's followed by a feudal period over in Europe. And then around the same time, and a little bit after, we have the feudal period in Japan, known as the Tokugawa or Edo period. Tokugawa is the name of the shogunate. Edo is the name of the city, which they had as their capital. So since this is a feudal structure, we have a similar system of hierarchies with mutual obligations that you saw developing in Europe. You have the emperor and shogun at the top. The emperor and shogun together are kind of like a king in Europe. Only here you have these 2 positions, so that the emperor is basically like the Queen of England today, just a figure with no real power. It's just ceremonial. The shogun in Japan had the military power, and this is where all of the power actually was. Underneath of that, you have the daimyo. Daimyo were the equivalent of lords in Europe. Underneath of the daimyo, you have the samurai. Samurai, of course, being the equivalent of the knights. And then you have the serfs or the peasants, which, of course, are the equivalent of the serfs or the peasants in Europe. During this time period, though, just like in Europe, feudalism brings stability to the region and allows this period of flourishing. Remember, in Europe, after the feudal period created this stability, you're allowed to have humanism and the development of the Renaissance, this flourishing or rebirth. Same thing is going to happen during the Tokugawa or Edo period in Japan, once again, because of the stability that feudalism brings. So culture is going to flourish quite dramatically. And throughout this period, the Tokugawa period, Edo period in Japan, they are isolating. They're keeping out most Europeans. A similar thing had happened in Japan as happened in China, in that you have Jesuits in particular coming and trying to convert people to Christianity. And just like China, they do have some success, about a couple 100,000 people converting to Christianity in Japan. Of course, just like China, there's still a Christian presence in Japan today. But the Japanese, once the Tokugawa period begins, are going to follow the pattern that China has established and want to isolate dramatically. They are going to allow one and only one group of Europeans to actually trade with them, and it's going to be the Dutch. And I hope you remember why, because we see this as the pattern with the Dutch no matter where they go. What aren't the Dutch concerned with? Religion. They don't care what religion you are. They're not there to convert you. All they want to do is trade and set up a trade relationship. So the Dutch are going to be allowed in Japan, but very similar to the Canton system, they're only going to be allowed in one city, and they're going to keep them quite isolated. Despite that, Dutch culture does really impact Japan, and you see a lot of the Arab technology that had been acquired through the Crusades and the Reconquista. You're going to see that that knowledge, that rebirth that then triggers the Renaissance. You're going to see that information being transferred to Japan through the Dutch during the Edo period, and leading to a lot of the cultural flourishings that we see there. The examples that I had given you in class were basically examples of literature and theater and the arts. So that we have origami. You'll remember when we made the origami samurai hats. You have all of the various types of theater, highly sophisticated, bunraku, for example, no theater, and others. So it's this equivalent kind of the European Renaissance that happens in Tokugawa era in the Edo period of Japan. Finally, the last group that we need to look at for this period from 1450 to 1750, this period prior to industrialization, this period of sea-based empires coming out of Europe, is the reaction of Russia. Now, keep in mind, Russia is in a slightly different situation because they had, for a couple hundred years, been dominated by the Mongols. And if you'll remember, Dmitry is going to be the first to kind of fight against the Mongols and start to defeat them. That will be solidified with Ivan, and Moscow then is going to become the center of Russia, of Tsarist Russia. If you remember, Ivan has one goal, and it's to unite the diverse Russian populations who practiced different religions at that point, had different ethnicities, different cultural practices, different languages. And he realizes that religion is a very powerful tool of unity. And so he sends out emissaries to all parts of the world to explore some of the world religions, and ultimately decides on Greek Orthodoxy. He's going to be able to go and send people to Constantinople before the fall of the Byzantine Empire. He's going to be impressed with Greek Orthodoxy, and he's going to consider the Russian people then as kind of the relatives or the descendants of Greek Orthodoxy, the saviors of Greek Orthodoxy, so that when the Byzantine Empire falls, Russia really becomes a hub of Orthodox Christianity, and as the only nation in the world to kind of carry on the form of government or the nature of government that you saw in ancient Rome with the Caesars. And that, of course, is where the term Tsar comes from, Tsar, Caesar. So that's why in Russia they're going to call their leaders Tsars. So Tsar Ivan is going to really unify Russia during this early phase after expelling the Mongol, the Golden Horde, the Mongol Khanate that had occupied Russia for a couple hundred years. After Ivan, we're going to have a couple of other leaders, but then we get to Peter the Great, who is probably the most significant figure during this period. Peter the Great is going to have some dealings with Europeans, particularly Swedes, and they are going to lose militarily. They're going to realize, Peter the Great is the first one to realize that Russia really can't compete with some of these other countries that are much smaller than them and they should be able to compete with. So he dresses up in disguise, travels throughout Europe, and what he's doing is he's gathering intelligence. He's gathering information on how Europeans dress, on how they eat, on how they organize their military, on how they organize their economics, on all aspects of society. And he takes this information back to Russia, and he decides that he's going to force the Russian leaders and upper classes to start to copy the West. So Peter the Great initiates this huge phase of Russian westernization, where they are embracing everything from the way you wear your hair down to the way education and political positions are determined. So everything is going to be modeled on the West. And he was really brilliant because he took the best military from one country and then maybe the best education system from another country. So he's picking and choosing the best things and creating a new system back in Russia. This is going to be very successful. Still doesn't put Russia on top, but it's going to make Russia a major competitor, a major force within European and Asian and Middle Eastern history. So we're going to continue to see Russia having prominence in the history of that part of the world for quite some time. After Peter the Great, we're going to have then Catherine the Great coming into power a little bit later. Peter the Great, the thing with Peter the Great and Catherine the Great is that most of the reforms that they do, most of the westernization that they do, it's only in the cities. And it's only for your urban, middle and upper class individuals. The peasantry throughout Russia, it stays very much how it had been for millennium, for centuries and centuries. Very, very rural, very ethnic. That won't change until the Soviet period. So during this phase, Russian leaders like Peter the Great and Catherine the Great once again, are kind of allowing the peasants, the serfs, to do whatever they want regarding culture and so forth out in the countryside. And they're more concerned with copying the West in cities and with their upper classes. Catherine the Great is going to be considered by some, including Voltaire, to be an enlightened despot, somebody who is making decisions, an absolute ruler, but still is making decisions that are going to lead to the good for everyone in her country. Now, I, of course, and many other people would take issue with that, because while she might have advanced things for the wealthy in Russia, the situation for the serfs gets increasingly worse. Both Peter the Great and Catherine the Great exploit the heck out of the serfs. In fact, Russia will be the last nation on earth to have feudal serfdom abolished. And the reliance on serfs in Russia is just very much based on exploitation and harsh exploitation. So while she does do great things, it's all on the backs of the serfs and increasing the exploitation of the serfs, the rural populations. The one really good thing she does do, among others, is that she is able to come down here and take over parts of the Black Sea. Now, remember, Russia, the thing they lack is a warm weather port. They have some ports up here. They're iced over for much of the year. They have a few up here, but once again, it's very, very, very cold, and they can't use them all year long. Black Sea, when they gain this portion of it, they're going to gain access to some of the major trade routes. But keep in mind who owns the bottom portion of the Black Sea, or I should say who controls the bottom portion of the Black Sea. It's going to be the Ottomans. In the next unit after the midterm, we're going to see that this issue with the Black Sea is going to bring the Ottomans head to head with Tsarist Russia and result in one of our first major industrial wars, which is going to be the Crimean War, where Tsarist Russia and the Ottomans will face off here in the Black Sea. Europeans will become involved, and this is the first time you're going to see the industrial power of these factories which can produce weapons of war and the destruction that can result from it. So that is the period of 1450 to 1750. Just to recap, we have Spain and Portugal exploring initially, but relying too heavily on mercantilism and finding gold and silver, not focusing on production. Then we have France and the Dutch starting to develop commercial infrastructures, but not going far enough. The Dutch being too small, really don't ever advance, and France overextending itself militarily is going to lead to its decline, as well as the fact that it didn't have too much success with forming settlements in the Americas. And then you have Britain, who is finding no gold, no silver, but turns out to be a good thing because it's going to push them to focus on production and manufacturing, which eventually will lead them into the Industrial Revolution first. Outside of Europe, you have the Ottomans and the Safavids and the Mughals kind of doing the same old thing they'd always done, contiguous land-based empires. In all three situations, but particularly the Ottomans and the Safavids, Europeans are going to be allowed greater access and entrance into their politics and their economics. The Mughal Empire, you're going to see a highly advanced system developing, but there's this lack of stability, lack of tolerance, and still focusing on those land-based contiguous empires. They're going to not engage in sea-based power, and that's going to be to their detriment. And then Qing Dynasty, Ming Dynasty are going to isolate, and you're going to see that isolation leading later to like complacency, falling into the high equilibrium trap. With the Tokugawa period, they're going to isolate as well. And we haven't gotten to this yet, but we're going to see that that has prevented Japan from advancing also. China and Japan, by isolating, are going to miss out on some of the major developments that are happening, particularly regarding industrialization, and it's going to lead to the control of both regions by Europe for a long time, or at least temporarily. And then finally, Russia is going to be copying. And so you see Russia starting to follow the path of Western Europe, and they will continue to follow that path until World War I. World War I is going to be the turning point when they separate from Europe and follow the different path that is going to be the Communist Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution. So we're leading up to all of those changes, but this is the foundation that we have. So there is 1450 to 1750 in a nutshell. And I will come back later and do the final bit, map 3, which is 1600 to 1800.